Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today, where we will be providing a mid-year state drug testing law update for employers. This webinar is brought to you by Orange Tree Employment Screening, and the presentation will be given by Nina French, Managing Partner of the Current Consulting Group. Nina has been a longstanding member of the employee screening community, advising clients on drug testing strategy and occupational health and wellness operations. After the presentation, Nina will definitely be available to answer any questions you might have and to continue the conversation. If you have a question, please type a question in the chat window and we'll read it out loud after the presentation. Thank you so much for joining us, Nina.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. And thank you, everybody, for joining. I know it's busy times for everyone, and so hopefully today's session will be worth the while that you're spending. We know it is a topic that is absolutely of interest through the whole country for HR managers. People in general actually have a pretty good degree of interest about it. But today what we're going to do is we're going to focus on sort of this ever-changing landscape of drug testing and how you can keep up with it and how Orange Tree Employment can help you keep up with these things as well. So we've got the agenda. Those of you who've ever heard me before know that I don't tend to really actually read my slides. And so what I hope that you end today's session with is really a broader understanding. This is going to be, you're not going to get copies of the deck, but you'll get copies of this recording. And so you can refer back and look at these things. You don't have to take massive notes, but there's a lot of information on the deck that's available for your reference then. But today what we're going to cover is some of the newer legislation passed in 2018 so far, because it is crazy active right now. Then we're going to talk a little bit about, legalization and prescription drugs to kind of put some of this into a framework that maybe helps you not be, bored, right? You can look up these laws. What we want to do is make sure that you understand and you're being prepared and you're being proactive about the impact of these laws on you. So I don't know who you are, right? I can see the numbers of people on this call, but I'm assuming that you've got something to do. So that's safety, it's hiring, you're a C-suite, you're an owner-operator, you're a CFO, you've got some level of interest in this topic, and so we're going to try and frame it at that section into why you've got to be paying attention and what these progressing legislations mean to you. And then we're going to just cover quickly about the differences between state law and federal regulations. Again, a lot of framework, and then talk a little bit about laws and policies and how you really need to, move forward with this stuff now that you've got the information in front of you. We're going to end hopefully with about 10 minutes. I'll be able to see how many questions we have in, and if we can't get to all the questions, we can certainly follow up afterwards and respond to you via email. So let's start with where we are, 2018. It's been a super active year, and there have been 20 bills that are already pertaining to drugs and or alcohol in 2018. The states are listed there. They cover a bunch of topics. So opioid use in the workplace, workers' compensation updates, DUI and DUID. I'm going to let that one hang for a minute and go back to it. Updates to medical or to marijuana laws, and then drug testing in the workplace in general. DUI and DUID, if you're not familiar with the term, what does DUID means? Driving under the influence of drugs, right? And so we put it right there with DUI. What's important before we launch down this topic is for you to all understand one critical key component. As we go through this deck, you are going to see a bunch of things that talk about impairment. There is currently no drug test on the face of the earth that measures impairment for marijuana, right? So why, right? Impairment isn't a thing per se, right? When we look back at alcohol in the United States and driving under the influence of alcohol in the United States, that was something that was defined. It is a per se legal limit. It was defined both by experience and by science, right? So if you guys have paid any attention to drinking, right, people who are heavier drinkers may actually have a 0.06 or a 0.04, and you would never know it, right? I take 3 sips of wine, and I feel like I couldn't get behind a wheel. And so it is not a precise science. It is really where laws have settled based on this years of experience, right? We can use a breath alcohol device, and we can tell recent use. We know how alcohol metabolizes out of your system. And again, it's imprecise, right? If I'm sitting next to somebody who weighs 100 pounds and I've got a man next to me who is Hi, everybody. Hopefully, I am back and you can hear me. We had a disconnect on our system. I don't know what that was, but hopefully, we're back on. Apologize for that. So, back to the DUI topic, right? So, just got to be mindful that when we're talking about sort of the concept of legalized marijuana and the cart before the horse concept, it's really important because we don't have those laws. Some states are trying to define it. We also don't have that technology. You don't know with marijuana if someone has 75 nanograms on a urine drug test, if that means they took a hit right before they walked in the door off of a bong or vape, right? Or if they used it over the weekend long before they showed up to to take do an interview with you or caused an accident. And so as employers, I need you to be looking at this outside of your personal views and be putting the framework around it as to the complications that is going to cause for all of us as taxpayers, right? And then for all of us as employers. So I wanted to pause and make sure you had that framework as we go through. And there'll be a couple more times we sort of talk framework so that you can look at this. I know that of the people on this call, about 65 to 70% of you say, when polled, yeah, I'm okay. I'm pro-legalization of marijuana. What you don't say is I'm pro-legalization of marijuana very, very specifically, or I'm pro-legalization of marijuana in these cases. So, do you want people to be able to drive down your streets on your highway in your, cars with your kids on the road, being able to smoke pot, be impaired, have an accident, kill somebody, run into a school bus, and not be prosecuted because there's no there's nothing you can do to prove. And so again, this is a little bit of why this is going to be so costly to all of us, because it is legalization happening before we've sorted out all of the details. So any of you guys who have done a project like that and you haven't sorted out the details, there's a reason for saying the devil is in the details, and we have not done that here. So when we look at these different types of laws that were passed, they're all over the board, right? So this one is about employers paying for urine drug screening for workers' compensation benefits. And this is less about drug screening from an employment standpoint, but more about costs that you may bear the burden of as an employer. So if I have a prescription for 5 milligrams of oxycodone for a workplace injury, doctors who see me, saying, hey, I lost my prescription, I accidentally dumped it down the sink, I need you to write me a new one sooner, I would fall in that high-risk patients category. If I was somebody who'd already had an addiction issue, they are going to do testing when I'm going in to that workers' comp doctor, and you're going to be liable to pay for that based on sort of the risk level of the patients in Kentucky now. That's passed. When you look at this Utah House Bill 195, it creates a right to try cannabis-based treatment for those who are terminally ill, right? Kind of hard to disagree with that one in many ways. And I'll always give you the exceptions there, right? But so you can see how they can ingest it. Now, how you prove how you ingested it, I'm not 100% sure, right? I don't know if you flew. I don't know if you're growing it in your basement. I don't know if you flew out to a state that was legal and take it home in your suitcase. We don't know, but that's the only way that technically can be ingested. I'm not sure how they plan to enforce that. Insurers are not required to cover the costs. Insurers may deny coverage for terminally ill patients who choose to exercise their rights to try, right? So again, you might be saying, well, that's horrible. We should cover it. I want you to remember that cannabis, marijuana, THC, whatever you're going to call it, is a Schedule I drug in the United States. So when you're thinking about the quote-unquote soft costs that are going to affect you as an employer, when that comes across your desk in HR, you're going to have to fight, right? You're going to have to say, I don't know. You're going to have to go to the workers' comp. They don't even know how to enter it in the system because there's no legal drug except Marinol and Dronabinol, and they have those because they've been around since 1980s, right? So when we get to that section about legalization of marijuana, I want you to really understand why that's important. And here we are. So let's look at marijuana right now in 2018. The states that are in blue have recreational marijuana legalized. The states that are in orange have medicinal marijuana legalized. And the states that are in white don't have marijuana laws currently. No state has done recreational before they've done medical, so that's sort of the path this is taking. And it is well funded. Employers are not active. Normal and pro-legislation groups are extraordinarily well funded. They're funded by a bunch of different groups. Many of them are agricultural companies with billions of dollars that they're pumping behind this for a very good reason, right? And so there's a lot of economic impact that you hear in some of these ballot initiatives. What you've got to understand is that the costs are going to likely be borne by the taxpayers and employers. 70% of the costs are going to be borne by employers. And so when you see that, understand that although they're talking about tax revenue dollars that are so mighty and can do all of these great things, they're not talking about how they're going to take those tax revenue dollars and pay you when you get sued. They're not talking about how they're going to pay you when you get workers' comp claims. They're not talking about how they're going to pay you as a taxpayer when you're seeing healthcare costs go up, when you're seeing accidents and insurance costs go up. And so it's really important when you're looking at these ballot initiatives to understand that sometimes they just get tweaked and tweaked and tweaked, and then they eventually pass. And we see where there are multiple initiatives, multiple ballots in different states because they're trying to figure out the exact sweet spot and get it passed. But you really very often see no information about the negatives. Sort of they lead with those dollar signs. It's really important that you look at the states like Colorado and Washington where those statistics of positivity rates, of accident increases, of healthcare impact are starting to come out because they were the first ones to legalize it. Look at the case laws against employers about recreational marijuana, right, in those states and figure out how that's going to impact you when they're proposing in your state to have recreational or medical marijuana legalized. When you talk about prescription drug abuse, this is a national problem. We all know it. You would really quite literally have to have like blinders on to not know that. But we like to use this slide because I think it gives some good insight into the extent of this. This slide represents the number of opioid prescriptions per 100 people. So if you look at the ones in blue, those states in blue, for every 100 people, there have been 96 to 143 opioid prescriptions in that state. Kind of hard to believe, right? It's so extraordinary. And that is not marijuana. It is not the other types of drugs like benzodiazepines, Valium. You're just talking opioids here. And for those of you who don't know what the difference is between an opiate and an opioid, variation in the term, an opioid has all of those semi-synthetic drugs, right? The ones that you know now, fentanyl, oxycodone, hydromorphone, hydrocodone. They're like synthesized in laboratories now, and they're made, and they go through the FDA trials, and they get put on the market. Opiates are the ones that are really just based on the poppy plant and manufactured through that. And so they're just sort of like two shades, and that's why people are now using that term opioid versus opiate. Percent of increases in prescription filled in the past decade, right? This is what we talked about. Now, the methadone one is kind of crazy, right? 845% increase in prescriptions filled in the past decade. Why that one's so significant is that one is for people who are addicts, generally being used to help them get off of heroin. Heroin is an opiate. It is very often when people start abusing opioids and get hooked through a prescription and a legitimate prescription, then they move to street drugs, right? And so methadone prescriptions are so high because they're trying to get everybody off all of these other drugs. Amphetamines, not an opiate, on the rise. Fentanyl, oxycodone, look at the rise in how big all of these are. Right? So that is what we're seeing across the board. And so it's in your workplace. And again, when you're thinking about drugs, I want you to think about legal versus illegal drugs. Right? So many legal drugs are abused, and that's going to impact you in the workplace. Many legal drugs are prescribed and used as prescribed. There's no addiction. There's no abuse. It also affects you in the workplace, right? So if you have somebody who is performing a safety-sensitive task, and remember, be wary of what that means in your workplace, because historically, safety-sensitive is defined as somebody who is doing a job that can cause physical harm, right? Forklift operator, needles, box cutters, those kinds of things. In this world, again, as an HR person, advocate that perhaps some of the more safety-sensitive things are not those things that are causing physical damage, but they're causing like cybersecurity issues, right? Are you going to sell data because you're an addict? And so defining how in your policies the impact of use is just as important as the impact of abuse in your workplace. And you've got to have policies in place to deal with that. You've got, and those are sort of complicated. That's not our topic today, but you really have to be thinking about that and how you can handle it. Because I could be in there and be on 5 milligrams of oxycodone for whatever, a broken foot. But it doesn't mean I should be doing my job. And so then as an HR person, you've got to be thinking about what can we do, right? Are we 15 employees or above? So do we have to look at the Americans with Disability Act? Do we have to make accommodations? And what accommodations are we willing to make? What employee benefits do you have? Do you have family and medical leave that they can take? Do you have alternate positions you can put that person into during the period of time they're on that drug legally? You got to be thinking about all that when you're thinking about use and abuse. The good news is, if you're on PCP, it's an illegal drug and you can remove them from their job. No accommodations necessary, no use is required. But then you better have a system of drug testing in place and a great system of documentation, because policy, documentation, and consistency of process are what help you win cases, right? That's what's important. It keeps making sure that you are not discriminating and your practices are non-discriminatory. So when we look at all these current issues, you've got to look at the increase in controlled substances for all of these different reasons. You've got to look at the opioid and opiate epidemic. We know that, I hope you know, that the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, expanded the federal drug testing program for January 1, 2018, and now they include those semi-synthetic opioid drugs, hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxycodone, oxymorphone. They do not include fentanyl, things like that. It is not all-inclusive. There are new drugs, hundreds of new drugs on the market every year, and you've got to know how to write your policy so that you don't have to keep changing it to keep up with that. Medication interactions are issues, right? So people may be on two different drugs from two different prescribers, and they can have issues in the workplace. And again, that doesn't mean they're abusing it, but you have to know what to do with that when issues like that arise, because they are a bear. They're very time consuming. And so you know what the issues are, you know about the availability, and now you've got to think about this progressing legislation to watch and try and think about all of those things we've talked about and how they play a role in this. I'm going to point out two things to you about prescriptions and about marijuana. When you look at how we legalize drugs in the United States, marijuana has taken a completely alternate route. Marijuana is still illegal. It's still a Schedule I drug. A Schedule I drug means it cannot be legally prescribed in the United States. I want to parallel it to heroin, right? Heroin is a great drug if I just had my leg cut off. I would want heroin. It would take away a lot of that pain. I would be so happy to have that drug. And it would be effective in taking away that pain. The reason it's a Schedule I drug is because it has been shown to do more harm than good. Highly addictive, right? And so that's why they've categorized it as a Schedule I drug. When you look at some of these drugs that are coming to the market, they went through all of these FDA trials, right? They did the right things. They manufactured it. They spent millions and millions of dollars on research and development of the drugs. They did clinical trials, including human trials. They can list every counter indication that they're aware of. They can list the harm. They can list the risks of addiction on that thing you get from the pharmacy, right? They can tell you all of that stuff. But if you crush it up and you snort it, it's going to cause you harm. And so there's use and there's abuse, and there's always complications within those. When you look at marijuana, it is not legal to be prescribed. The pro-marijuana movement that we talked about did not mistakenly say, let's get this legalized medicinally first by telling you the stories that were like, true stories, right? So there are people who are terminally ill and it can probably help them. If the purpose was for this to be a medicinal drug, then those of you who are voting and looking at these initiatives would be mindful that really the move is pressure the federal government to take it off a Schedule I drug, to allow it to be grown under clinical settings and be tested, expedite those FDA trials, and be available. But I wouldn't want somebody in my family who is really ill to get a card from a doctor, and there's a lot of green doctors out there. If you go to California, you can actually get a medical marijuana card and your drugs delivered to your hotel before you get there from the airport. In Pennsylvania, it's only allowed medicinally for 7 purposes. I suffer from none of those 7 purposes, but it took me 45 minutes and $250 to see a doctor, have my card, and be able to get prescribed marijuana in the state of Pennsylvania. The people who are distributing marijuana are not pharmacists. There's no prescription, right? There's no prescription. You're not allowed to prescribe it. So again, when you're an employer and you're thinking about that, when those people are in your healthcare system using your benefits, what are you going to do, right? Are you going to pay for stuff? Are you not going to pay for it? That alone is going to take money for you. Are they going to vape it? Are they going to have more incidences of COPD? You got to be thinking about all of those different things because they're going to affect you. So with marijuana, when we see states like California and Colorado, what we saw was there was this run and lots and lots and lots, hundreds of thousands of people got medicinal marijuana cards or certificates. When recreational marijuana became available, it dropped by 70% because suddenly those people actually didn't have that problem. They just wanted to smoke pot, right? And now we're seeing, if you Googled it to prove me right or wrong at the moment, you would find that there are actually return on investment calculators for people in those states that look at the taxes being higher on recreational marijuana than they are on medicinal marijuana. And so they do a cost benefit analysis for users and say, if you use 4 grams or more in the course of a week or a month, then it pays you to pay for your marijuana card because then your taxes are lower and you can get it through the medicinal route versus the medical route. So pay attention because they're anticipating that you're not when you're voting on these legislation. So look at some of these, right? Alaska has updates that require employee drug testing and worker compensation statutes, right? That's a good one. Not good, but that's sort of pro drug testing and the employer's rights to drug testing. So is Maryland. Maryland, this has just been a fluky thing that's forever out there. Maryland left out breath alcohol testing for employees or applicants. So when that passes, and it shouldn't for really any reason, then that'll be great for those of you who are in Maryland. You can just use standard breath alcohol testing, and that's good. Vermont permits post-accident drug testing of employees, another pro-movement that allows you to use denial of workers' comp claims or get discounts possibly, should they go that route, when you're doing post-accident drug testing. Mindful of what we talked about earlier, though, right? No drug test right now measures impairment for marijuana. So even if you get a positive, you've got to make sure that your policy specifically states what you allow. If you're in a state where medical and recreation are available, you got to be thinking about how you're going to do that. Hair testing, right? It doesn't work for post-accident anyhow, but you're doing a long look back. That's clearly something you've got to be thinking about in the states where you've got medicinal and recreational marijuana legal already. Hair testing, how it's going to affect your policy. Is it going to be rendered as discriminatory in the practice? How are you going to say that the person didn't, within their rights, over 21 years old, use a drug that's legal in their state? So you've got to be careful and mindful of how these case laws are going in the states with those sort of definitions, right? Urine has a smaller window of detection for marijuana, but you still are looking back several days and possibly a week. And yes, you can always look back further and longer, depending on chronic use and things. That's the complication of drugs in general. But you know, in your head, I want you to be thinking about the look back of 3 days to a week for most cases, right? Oral fluid, you're looking at about 18 hours to 24 hours. So when you're working with your reps at Orange Tree, think about that for post-accident testing. It's legal in all 48 states. But you are going to see challenges to things like that. The law firms who are specifically targeting employers for marijuana, it's one of the fastest growing segments there is. So be wary of what's happening when these are coming up for a vote in your states. West Virginia, public policy to protect employer rights to continue to drug testing. Washington, D.C. changes the definition of safety sensitive with that proposed legislation. Again, all of them are sort of all across the board. When you're looking at marijuana specifically, California prohibits employers from discriminating against an employee or applicant based on their status as a medical marijuana card holder. So you can't say, oh, this guy told me he's got a card, I'm not going to hire him. But look at the second part of it. Prohibits employers from discriminating against an employer applicant that's a valid medical marijuana card holder based on a positive drug test. So all I have to do is go and get my card, and I can smoke pot all day, every day, including on your job site. and you can't terminate me for a positive drug test. Now, a customer can still sue you for negligence if that person makes a mistake or harms somebody. You still have to pay their workers' comp claim if they're high as a kite, they test positive, and they're driving your company vehicle. Be active. That is what you're going to be paying for. And no policy in the world can prevent them from suing you. A good policy and good processes can prevent you from, paying out, but you're still going to pay the legal costs to fight it. So be wary of these and be active if you're an employer in these states in understanding what the cost of this is going to be for you. If you drop drug testing or drop drug testing for marijuana, be wary that those negligence lawsuits are right around the corner as well. You're in a catch-22 as these continue to march on without protest, right? They will pass, and then you as employers will be left. So you didn't drug test. That was a reasonable expense as an employer for you to take. You allowed a known user. Everybody's on Instagram and Facebook. He talks about 420. He's smoking pot all the time. You allowed him. He didn't put out that little thingy on the floor. I slipped and I fell, so I'm going to sue you because I slipped and fell. And now I'm going to sue you for negligence, and that one's going to be 40 times higher than the award I get because you were negligent because you didn't do a drug test for marijuana. Hawaii prohibits employers from suspending discharging based on a qualification as a certified patient. Be mindful of how easy it is in those states to become a certified patient. I gave you my own. If you don't believe me, try it in your state. It is so easy. Hawaii HB 2220 prohibits an employer from suspending based on a positive marijuana test if you're a registered marijuana card. Imagine how easy it is as a user to just get around that, right? So again, be verbal. Indiana protects employers' rights to continue taking action against employers that are impaired by marijuana. So in that, you're getting a protection. However, there's no definition in Indiana or anywhere else about what impairment is. And you can't prove it through any drug test right now. And so that's the trouble, right? Look at how they're writing these. Indiana HB 1106 prohibits discrimination against medical marijuana users by employers. Don't know what that means, right? It can mean a whole lot of different things. Ill-defined, will be in court, and you will be fighting it. Makes illegal for employers to screen applicants or employees for THC unless it is required by federal law in Indiana. So you can see how strong the movement is in Indiana and in Hawaii and in California to really just allow rampant use of marijuana. When the school bus accidents come, we're going to be in the same place that we are now with opioids, which is, holy cow, we let this horse out of the gate, and now we have to try and reel it back in. And it is going to be hard, and it is going to be expensive, and it is going to cost employers a lot of money. Okay? So Kentucky, we see a protection for employer rights, specifically mentioning continued testing for marijuana. And these haven't passed, remember. These are things you can act on now. Maryland is much the same with prohibiting discrimination or penalizing medical marijuana card holders or caregivers. New Jersey, protections for medical marijuana users. Be mindful as well, people, when you're talking about medical marijuana, if you do a little bit of research on this, there's something called CBD or cannabidiol. CBD is the ingredient in marijuana that has been most effective as a medicinal drug. What we're finding, if you look online for distributors, is we're seeing THC, which is the thing that gets you high, the psychoactive piece, going from 10% in the 90s to 30%, 40, 50, 60, 70%. And no cannabidiol. So that's sort of the irony, right? It is what's getting you high increasing, but what's actually been proven in many cases to be helpful is going away. So you've got to understand the difference between CBD and THC, how that's playing a role in these laws. And again, if you're pro for medicinal purposes, then advocate it being at that federal level, getting testing in clinical trials so it can be done correctly. And again, back to that idea of like, use and abuse, right? Alcohol also has its purposes. People have been self-medicating with alcohol for a very, very long time, and often you can parallel the costs to alcohol use and abuse to what you do for marijuana. And there will be a million people who will raise their hand and say, oh no, alcohol is more addictive. Well, I won't disagree. I'll say, sure, yes, it is proven to be more addictive than marijuana in many cases. However, not marijuana, it's 70% THC and 0% cannabidiol. We're entering into a whole new world because what's available is the wild, wild west. And so we're going to find ourselves in 10 years looking back and saying, holy cow, why did we ever, we're pretty much putting grain alcohol in somebody's hand by letting them have a THC oil with 70%, or hemp oil, or I'm sorry, a marijuana oil with 70% THC. We're giving them grain alcohol and then letting them get behind the wheel or come to work. What were we thinking? So be mindful of all those things. Look at some more of the laws. New York provides that marijuana positive on a drug test does not determine whether someone is under the influence at work or be the basis of a hiring action or disciplinary action. Again, that means they're trying to push to drop marijuana. And these are most often proposed by NORML or one of those groups and brought up through the legislature and then hoping nobody's paying attention. They are active. If you look on their website, we're members at CCG. We go to their conference. We see what they're all about. If you look, they have these great tools that they send out to their base, and they show them how to automatically write to the legislature for these things to be proposed or to be approved. But we don't do that as employers in general. So you got to be thinking about that. So look at Washington prohibits employers from refusing to hire based for a medical marijuana patient or a positive drug test. You can see sort of how these all go in the same fashion. The wording is slightly different, but all of these are really giving protections for use of marijuana in the workplace. Medical marijuana, again, these are the step, right? This is the step to getting it recreationally legalized. But Indiana, Kentucky, Missouri, Nebraska, New Mexico, Oklahoma specifies CBD only. You now know what it is if you didn't walk into this. Oklahoma, South Carolina, Virginia, and Wisconsin are all looking at legalizing medicinal marijuana in one way, shape, or form. Look at Indiana. Remember, Indiana was on our other slide back here, and they're really pushing for you to not be able to test, and look how active they are for medical marijuana, right? And so they're pushing very quickly. Will be likely one of the states that if things don't turn around, that you're going to see recreational on the deck next year. And then these are the states that are proposing legalized recreational marijuana in 2018. And again, if your state is listed here with the law, I suggest you look at it very carefully and you look at where the dollars are being proposed to be spent. And you look if the protections are there, DUI, how are you going to measure it? Look very carefully. So if you look at some of these laws, they tell you what the potential ballot measures are in some of these states as well. Now, ballots differ, right? So ballot can be like a question to gauge the level of interest from the voters, or it can be literally a ballot, and if the people vote, it goes through. Legislative initiatives are the elected officials who are voting on it. But keep in mind that their major look is at money. And so you've got to get in front of get in front of the voters in each of these regards and explain how it's going to be so costly for you. When people are vaping more often, are your health care costs going to go up? When they're absent more often, when the turnover is greater, when you see employee theft, when you have issues at work and higher emergency visits, when you're thinking about just how people are ingesting it, right? When you smoke pot or vape it, you get high pretty fast unless you've got like some bad homegrown weed, right? If you are taking a 10 milligram bite of a chocolate bar and you've got 10 bites for 100 milligrams and you eat it, 15 minutes later, you're not high. So you're going to take another. 15 minutes later, you feel all right, but you're like, gosh, I'm like barely stoned. So you take another. Now you've got 30 milligrams, and it hits you like a freight train. And they're at their desk, or they're in their car, or they're your 21-year-old driving home, and they didn't realize, because there's no standardization, they didn't know I drank my 2 beers, and now I can still get in the car half an hour later. I drank my 1 bourbon, and it's a half an hour later, I'm feeling comfortable and can get in the car, and I'm under the legal limit, and I'm not impaired. Or I did a shot of grain, and I know I cannot get in the car. Marijuana, you don't really know what you're getting. There's no standardization. There's more information on the back of a Coca-Cola. There's more information on the back of a vitamin B12. There's a heck of a lot more information on like a Tylenol. In fact, there's more information generally on like Oreos. And if you haven't visited just to find that out, it's really, really interesting to go visit a distributor, both medicinal or recreational, and learn how untrained the people are behind the counter. I did it in Colorado, much to my brother's chagrin, who I was with, who was like, please don't pretend you're a narc. And I did it. And the guy behind the counter told me the candy bar I was going to buy. He told me all stuff about how good it was. And trust me, I was ready to eat it right there, because it was that whole sea salt and caramel with chocolate, and it sounded delicious. And I said, how much like pot is in here? Because I was trying to not know the terms. And the guy said, it's 100%. I said, what? I don't know how it could be 100%, because there's chocolate and sea salt and caramel. You just told me it can't be 100%. Could it be? And he said, oh God, no, you're right. It's 100 milligrams. Okay. So how much should I take? I don't usually use it. I'm going up to the cabin in the woods with 12 kids. How much should I take? Now, depending on how you feel about parenting at this moment, the answer should have been the whole candy bar, or it should have been none, because you got 12 kids in the woods. His answer was, I don't know, probably between 30 milligrams, which is like 3 little break-off pieces, if you're thinking like of a Hershey bar, that's how it looked, or up to the whole thing. It depends. And I thought, okay, I would be like passed out on the floor. And so it isn't even like a pharmacy tech. You're getting advice. And unfortunately for medicinal patients, because there's no standards too, if you listen to the news reports, you're hearing the feedback about how disappointed they are, because they did get these cards, and they really are. They're legit, right? They have children with issues. They have loved ones with issues, and they are trying to do it right and use it and see if it works. But nobody explained to them the difference between CBD and THC. And when they bought it, they don't know which one's going to work and which strains. And so it really is just trial and error. It's awfully frustrating to do trial and error on somebody who's very sick. And you're trying to guess, right? That's like taking Tylenol and lining them all up and saying, I don't know, I've got a headache, or my kid has a headache. Should I be giving him the extra strength Tylenol 4, 7, 2? Should I give him the Tylenol PM? It's after 7. I don't know what that means. Should I give him the liquid stuff that's 0 to 2? I don't know. I'm just going to pick one, see how it goes. And that's really what's happening. And so it's important to understand that when you're looking at the difference between state laws and federal regulations, you've got to understand how all of this interplays, right? So I'm not going to read this, but state laws are subordinate to federal laws and regulations. Federal laws govern state laws only when federal and state laws conflict with one another. In order for federal regulations and laws to supersede state laws, they must be impossible to comply with both. That's where we're at, people, right? It's really impossible to comply with both right now. So theoretically, federal law governs, but it's just not that simple anymore. So when we look at a case study in Rhode Island drug testing statute says that it prohibits workplace drug testing without reasonable suspicion of drug use. Random testing is not permitted in the workplace, but the DOT supersedes it. It requires random drug testing. It requires other drug testing as specified in Part 40. It's impossible for employers with federally mandated employees to comply. So for safety-sensitive DOT-regulated employees, the DOT regulations supersede Rhode Island state law. Now, that goes in every case. DOT supersedes right now. For all other employers, all other employees outside of the federally mandated ones, then the employers must comply with the Rhode Island state law. So technically, the state statutes legalizing marijuana should be invalid. However, you guys have seen this on the news too, right? The federal government has chosen not to enforce those federal laws. They could invalidate all the state laws pertaining to recreational marijuana. It's likely not going to happen. The American with Disabilities Act and medical marijuana further complicates things because it prohibits discrimination based on a disability, but it includes a provision that excludes the use of illegal drugs. So marijuana, while illegal under federal law, is not protected under the ADA. Important for you guys to think about when you're looking at your policies, right? It is going to still get protest, or it's going to get contested. Just be ready for it. But it's important for you guys to know these nuances when you're looking at it from an HR and a policy perspective. Some states have disability laws. Some of them do not include provisions excluding illegal drugs. Some do. Some state disability laws may protect medical marijuana, even though the ADA does not. And so it's really still this gray area, and unfortunately the gray area for laws mean ripe for litigation that you will pay to fight. Laws and policy, it's an interactive process. So like we've been talking about, I can say with assurance right now that if you've not looked at your policy in over a year, it is very likely, high likelihood, we're talking 90%, that you're missing something and it needs to be updated. Why? Because 20 states, although they're not governed by the DOT and DHHS panel and regulations, they reference them in their laws. So if you're in one of those 20 states, you were required to make an update based on the new DOT regs, HHS and SAMHSA regs that came out in January. Other than that, this ever-changing work environment, you've got to be updating your policies. In states like California, there's only case law. In other states, there's mandatory drug testing law that applies to every employer who's doing business in the state. There's also mandatory law that applies to certain industries. West Virginia has a mining mandatory law. There's also voluntary drug testing laws that are discount laws. And then there's workers' comp and unemployment laws that are denial laws. So if you test positive and you have a workers' comp claim, we can deny it and we don't have to pay it. Now there's medical laws and medical marijuana laws and recreational marijuana laws. And then there's case law that affects or influences you as an employer if there's none of these other kinds of laws. So what's an effective drug testing policy? We clearly can't advise everybody on this call in this training about what it means, but the first step is you've got to implement a drug-free workplace program. That in itself is a common term that is actually not true. You cannot have a drug-free workplace, right? That means you're not taking an aspirin and you're not allowing your employers to, but it's the common term, right? The most important tool used is the policy that you've got in place. It creates a protection against litigation. When people come to us, they say, can you write us a policy so that we can't get sued? Can you guarantee it so that we can't get sued? And our answer is we write thousands of policies. We work with Orange Tree. We work with a lot of different employers and write policies. We can't protect you against getting sued. A good policy is the best protection, but people can sue you for anything. It doesn't mean it's not going to get thrown out, but now they've got so much gray area, there's a likelihood that it's actually going to go to settlement or go to litigation. And so it's important that your policy is as good as it can be in these very murky times. You want to make sure that you're in compliance with state laws and federal regulations, that you've got a program manager and a designated employer rep. You've got coverage of who's this covering, right? Is it just our safety sensitive? Is it just our pharmacy reps? Is it just our people who are driving company cars? Is it everybody? You've got to say what prohibited conduct is. Very important that you're documenting and you're looking and you're training your supervisors and you're training your employees on signs and symptoms, how to document it, what to do, right? Types of drugs, types of drug tests, whether you've got OSHA and medical marijuana to deal with, testing methodologies, what you're going to use. You can mix and match. Orange Tree can help you discover why you're doing drug testing, what you want to do. Get a policy written, help you get the training, and you can work and combine things, right? So you can have hair testing and oral fluid testing and urine testing and breath alcohol testing for different reasons. As long as it's non-discriminatory and the practices are upheld throughout the organization, then you can do all of those different things. Establishing what the cutoff levels are, what the disciplinary actions are for violations of the policy, and then track the progression of this legislation and the laws that passed and make sure you're regularly updating your policy. And that's how to implement a policy and work with the team at Orange Tree to help you do that. And so with that, I would ask us to open the floor. And Suzanne, do we have any questions that we can answer on today's call?
We do, and thank you, Nina. That was very interesting and very informative. I have a question just to kick it off here, and then just a reminder to please ask your questions in the chat window, and we'll be sure to read them on the webinar. But Nina, do you think that labs or manufacturers will soon have a test for impairment?
They are all running towards it. There's actually a group that we work with that it has a new test methodology that's undergoing clinical trials, and they will be commercial ready very shortly. And so I think they will, but everybody is running as fast as they can because everybody needs it. And now people are starting to realize, note that I said they're in California, right? They're starting to realize the extent of the problems in not having one. And so they are moving as quickly as they can. So, yeah, I would expect that we'll see different methodologies. Keep in mind, though, even after they come out, there's going to be, again, this very strong, well-funded movement is going to try and discredit them. So it's going to take a while. And, again, that's why it's important to look in your states and see, like, what do they allow hair? Do they allow urine? Do they allow blood? Do they allow breath? And for what things? Because that'll be another pull that these new methodologies have to get over to make sure that they can be used in your states. Okay. Any other questions?
I do see a question here. Would you advise removing marijuana testing for some positions and not others?
That's a slippery slope. I think, and we didn't cover that in today's webinar specifically, but you would have to make sure it's non-discriminatory. You would open yourself up by not testing to that concept of negligent hiring. So you'd almost have to have as effective as an argument as to why these people could use marijuana, and it wouldn't, you'd have to kind of like position it counter against the literature that says, yeah, they can be impaired. And so it's a tough one. It could be done. I certainly would not recommend it. And then the other thing is, as a hiring person, even if you're not inside of safety, I get it. Unemployment's at 3%. You want to get bodies in the seat. You're struggling. In Colorado and Washington, we're seeing 20 and 23% positivity rates for marijuana in those states. It's a little bit like short-sighted. And I always use the idea of going to the gym, right? Every day I don't want to go to the gym because I really don't like to. But every day I try and get up and go to the gym so that when I turn around in 10 years, I don't have an issue that's way bigger and something I can't control. The concern is if you start to hire employees who are drug users, even if it's just marijuana, the downstream impact is going to start to creep up on you, like healthcare costs going up And again, when we see like those levels of the drugs getting stronger, you're going to see the impact to healthcare, productivity. You can take those sort of known things and apply it and realize that there's going to be a cost to your organization in doing that. And you've got to really decide if that's a cost you're willing to bear.
Okay. I see some questions about the webinar being available after the fact, and we will send out a recording of the webinar, so you will have that available to you in the future. One other question, Nina, do you have any tips for implementing saliva drug testing?
Yes, and again, talk to Orange Tree. Saliva drug testing is actually easy. So the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you're one of the 48 states that allow it. And it's called oral fluid, technically. That's the real term. It's like the opioids. Only drug testing nerds like me really know this. But because they're collecting different stuff in your mouth, right? Not just saliva. They are excellent in many ways because you can, if you're in a remote area or if you're operating like 7 days a week, 365, 24 hours, you've got the collecting device there, and then it's laboratory. I do recommend using a laboratory tested device. The instant ones don't really pick up drugs very effectively, so it's almost like not doing a test at all. You can, but especially THC is really hard in an instant device, and many of them aren't FDA cleared for all the drugs in the panel. So mindful of that. But yeah, it's easy. The training is easy, and they really are like donor, self-collected, supervisor observed collections. So yeah, they are easy. Have them in your policy. Any big policy changes like that, you'd want to make sure you give to your employees and your supervisors about 30 days or 60 days ahead of time. But they're easy to implement. They're very effective. And remember, the best advice when you're going to do something like that is you don't have to do it all at once. So pick an area, pick a position, pick a place, and try it. And you can, like I said, use your own collectors, or you can use collection sites if you'd prefer to have that professional collector in the mix. So they're great options.
Okay, and just a reminder, any questions, put them in the chat window, please. And then I'm seeing one more here, and this might be a bit of a duplication, but how can we best use instant read drug testing devices to remain compliant with all of the state drug testing laws?
Oh, well, you have to check because those are, everybody, again, every different names, but instant point of care test, POCT, people call them all different things. There are some that are instrumented read. So some of you are familiar with those devices where it's being read by a machine. And then there are some that are just you looking at it. So if you are going to use instrument read ones, they're very effective, right? And you wait for a confirmation. If you're going to use the truly instant ones, find a good one, right? Make sure you're getting a good one. Always use a chain of custody. Have a method for tracking the device. So you want to see a picture of it. Have a method for tracking inventory, right? Because you want to make sure at a local level that someone's not saying, oh yeah, I just wanted him to get the job and I was so desperate to get a supervisor that I just did it myself. Or when he tested positive, I told him to come back 3 days later, right? So sort of you need to make sure all of those things are under control, and you want to have a way to track it. So work so that you can make sure you are entering the device with the chain of custody and you've got a record that everybody had one, because then someone can cry foul and say you weren't giving them to everyone, right? And then lastly, so you've got good procedures, good collection procedures, privacy for the employer or the employee. You've got trained collectors involved in the process, whether they be yours or the other. And then you want to have chain of custody protocols. You want to have inventory protocols. You want to make sure it's allowed in your state. And then finally, you want to make sure that you don't ever take, and I don't care if your state says to or not, don't ever take a negative employment action unless you've got a confirmed positive. So send that sample off to the laboratory and have it tested if it screens non-negative. Really important.
Okay, thank you, Nina. I think we went through all of our questions here. Just a reminder that if you were interested in CEU credit, to please email credit@currentconsultinggroup.com. Or if you have questions for Orange Tree after the presentation, you can email info@otes.com. Again, the presentation will be available after the fact as a recording. And thank you so much, Nina, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you for having us. Bye-bye. Suzanne? Hello?